All right, let's talk about the American Revolution, but maybe not in the way you're used to thinking about it. For a minute, let's look past the battlefields and the muskets, because at its heart, the revolution was really a war of words, a huge empire-wide debate over some really powerful ideas, ideas about freedom, loyalty, and what government is even for.
So what kicked this whole thing off? Was it one single event? One single bad law? No way. It was much more complicated than that. It was more like a massive argument that took over all 13 colonies. In every town, every pub, every home, people were debating their future. And the stakes? They were incredibly high. So let's get into it.
Okay, let's set the scene. The year is 1760-something. The French and Indian War has just ended, and Great Britain is feeling pretty good about its massive victory. But victory is really, really expensive. To pay off its huge war debts, Britain looks over at its American colonies and basically says, all right, time for you to chip in. And that meant new taxes, which, as you can guess, led to new problems.
And really, this whole conflict boils down to two big competing worldviews. On one side, you have this idea of order and loyalty. The thinking here is pretty straightforward. We are part of the British Empire, and our prosperity, our safety, it all depends on being loyal to the king and parliament. But on the other side, you have this incredibly powerful idea of liberty and rights. This belief that as Englishmen, they were born with fundamental rights that no government, not even the king, could just take away.
So first, let's try to understand one of the main voices in this debate, the Loyalists. These were American colonists. We're talking maybe a third of the whole population. And they were absolutely terrified by the idea of rebellion. They were making a passionate case for staying with Britain. And this quote, it gets right to the heart of their biggest fear. For a loyalist, going to war against Great Britain, the biggest, baddest empire on the planet, wasn't just an act of treason. It was complete suicide. They were convinced it would lead to nothing but chaos and the destruction of everything they'd built. You see, their argument wasn't just we love the king. It was built on some very real, practical fears. They were convinced a war would absolutely crush the colony's economy. They were worried that if the rebels somehow won, you'd just have mob rule, total anarchy. Plus, they needed the British Army and Navy for protection from countries like France and Spain. For them, paying some extra taxes was a small price to pay for all the benefits of being part of the British Empire.
So you might be wondering, how did Britain justify taxing colonists who had no one in London to vote for them? Well, they had this interesting idea called virtual representation. The theory was that a member of Parliament in London didn't just represent his local district, he represented the interests of the entire empire, from London to Boston. Yeah, as you can imagine, a lot of colonists weren't buying that argument.
And that, of course, brings us to the other side of this whole debate, the Patriots. Now, it's really important to remember that they didn't start out screaming for independence. Not at all. Their argument began as a passionate, desperate call for their rights as British citizens.
In the early days, patriots saw themselves as the true defenders of British law. They weren't trying to break away. They were arguing that Parliament, by taxing them without their consent, was the one breaking the rules. They felt they were just fighting for the rights they were already supposed to have. But how did they actually make their point? Well, it wasn't just with strongly worded letters. When a law like the Stamp Act came along, the resistance got real. You had organized public protests, for sure, but things could get much more intense. Mobs used threats and intimidation to scare tax collectors into quitting. They would stage symbolic acts of violence, like creating a life-size doll, an effigy of an official like Mr. Oliver, and then burning it in the street. And sometimes they threatened actual property, warning they would pull down and burn the stamp office to the ground.
And then, in 1776, a guy named Thomas Paine drops a little pamphlet called Common Sense, and it just completely changes the game. Paine's argument was explosive. He said the problem wasn't just a few unfair taxes. The problem was the whole idea of having a king in the first place. This quote says it all. Government is something you put up with only because you have to.
Paine's ideas just spread like wildfire, and they fueled that final argument for a total break from Britain. The whole conversation shifted. Suddenly, Britain wasn't the protective parent country anymore. It was a greedy empire that was just using the colonies to get rich. The king wasn't a protector, he was a tyrant. The Patriots started to argue that America was big enough, strong enough to go it alone, and that independence was the only way to guarantee a future of real freedom and opportunity.
So, where did these radical ideas about rights and government actually come from? They didn't just appear out of thin air in the colonies. They were part of this massive intellectual shift happening in Europe called the Enlightenment.
This right here gets to the absolute core of the argument. You've got these two English thinkers. First, there's Thomas Hobbes. He thought people were naturally selfish and violent, and without a powerful king to keep everyone in line, life would just be a chaotic war of all against all. Sounds a lot like the loyalist fear of mob rule, right? But then you have John Locke. He had a much sunnier view of humanity. He argued people are reasonable and that we're all born with natural rights, like life, liberty, and property. And for Locke, a government is only legitimate if it rules with the consent of the governed. That idea, it became the absolute foundation for the patriot cause.
And that leads to this incredibly powerful concept, the social contract. Think of it like a deal. We, the people, agree to give up a little bit of our freedom and follow the government's rules. In return, the government's job is to protect our natural rights. But here's the catch. If the government breaks that deal, if it starts taking away our rights, then the people have the ultimate right to rebel and create a new government. I mean, you can see just how revolutionary that idea was.
So here we are. We have this huge, raging debate across the colonies. One side is yelling for order and loyalty. The other is screaming for rights and liberty. But eventually, the time for just talking comes to an end.
And this is the moment it all breaks. At the Battle of Lexington in 1775, the arguments on paper turn into arguments with gunpowder. When you look at an engraving of the battle from that time, like this one, the message is pretty clear. You see the British soldiers in their bright red coats firing on the colonial militia. This was it. This was the point of no return.
Okay, so when you look at any source from this period, say a letter from a merchant or an engraving of a battle, you can use this simple framework. First, step 1, identify the viewpoint. Who made this? Are they coming from a loyalist or a patriot perspective? Step 2, isolate the key arguments or the main message. What specific reasons or actions is the author describing? If it's a picture, what is the artist trying to show you? And finally, step 3, uncover the core beliefs. Try to connect what you're seeing back to those big ideas. Is the source all about the chaos of rebellion, kind of like Hobbes? Or is it about the fight for natural rights, inspired by Locke? This is how you use evidence from the source and your own knowledge to really explain the causes of the revolution.
And that brings us to one last question to think about. The American Revolution was an argument that turned into a war. We all know who won the war on the battlefield. But the real question is, which side's arguments won? And how did those winning ideas continue to shape the world that you and I live in today?